Anybody else remember Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time? Because I sure do. I remember going around my friend's house on the weekends and we played it so much I'm surprised we didn't wear the damn disc out. I also remember his mum giving me a hamburger without a bun and some broccoli on the side, which I thought was a bit disrespectful, but I let it slide. I was around there 3 nights a week, so I practically owed that woman rent. Anyway, the game. Let's get back to the game. Man, I love this game. Mind you, I didn't actually play it very much. I was too scared of the sand zombies, so I just watched most of the time. But I never told my friend that, so you keep that to yourselves. But now I'm an adult. You think I'm scared of some sand zombies now? No, my friends. The void scares me far more than mindless fictional creatures. So I thought about my big boy courage, and I thought about my rapidly aging copy of the Prince of Persia HD collection, and I thought, why not? Let's see if these games are as good as I remember them. And you know what? I was surprised by the result. The Sands of Time is so much better than I ever thought it was. But it's also way worse than I remember it being. And trust me, I know that doesn't make any sense, but gosh darn it, it's the honest truth. And if you'll be so gracious as to allow me some time to explain it, I'll go into deep detail, like real deep. Undiscovered ocean floors deep. Alright, maybe not quite that deep, but like, you know, when you're in the swimming pool and there's that point where you're on your tippy toes and your nose is just barely sticking out of the water and you get a little bit cocky, so you sniff a bit too hard and you end up with a bunch of water in your nose and you think you're gonna die. It'll definitely be at least that deep.
Time is an ocean in a storm. You may wonder who I am and why I say this. Sit down, and I will tell you a tale like none that you have ever heard.
The Sands of Time tells the story of an unnamed prince, son to King Shahriman of Persia, and I tell you what guys, he messes up. He messes up big time. Because not only was he tricked, but he was also being a ginormous knob. After getting friendly with this shifty looking dude, the vizier of a Maharaja, this dude betrays his king and allows the prince and his father's army to ransack the place. As long as he gets to pick out whatever treasure he wants, once the dust has settled, he's all good. So, the Persians take the place over and at the end they come out with a few worthwhile items. One is the Dagger of Time, possessed by the prince. Another is an hourglass that houses the titular Sands of Time. And there's also a few slaves, you know, just the usual. But wait, amongst the slaves there is also the princess of the recently felled kingdom, Princess Farah. The whole point of this little excursion was to get a few prezzies for the Sultan of Azad, and he's found one in the hourglass. So they take their spoils of war to the Sultan and then things start to get a bit more interesting. The vizier tells the prince to take his new dagger and thrust it into the hourglass. And would you believe it, he actually does it and everybody gets turned into sand zombies, except of course the prince, Farah, and the vizier. Oh, and this other random guy. Now I don't know about you guys, but if I was the prince I'd probably have a few questions, like, what happens when I stab this thing? Why should I trust you? You just betrayed an entire kingdom, and you look pretty shifty. Why does the sand glow? Is it radiated? At least have a quick word with Dad. Maybe something along the lines of, hey Dad, before we go through with this, I just thought I'd let you know. Remember that new dagger I got? Well, turns out it rewinds time. I know, crazy, right? But here's the kicker. It runs on some kind of sand. Now, I'm no scientist, but sand in a dagger, sand in the hourglass, maybe we shouldn't mess with this one, pups. Maybe we should put it back. But no, none of that. This creepy dude told me to stab it, so better get stabbing. And so the journey begins. The prince and Farah, the only two survivors, two rivals at that, must work together to undo the prince's mistake, to save the world, whilst also preventing the vizier from carrying out his evil master plan, which is to, I don't know, actually. Doesn't really ever say. I'm gonna level with you guys and girls, I find it pretty difficult to praise older games for their looks. Unless we're talking about a Shadow of the Colossus or a more stylized series like Sly Cooper. Oh my god, I love Sly Cooper. I really have nothing to praise. I've been spoiled by the graphical leap that came with the PS3 and Xbox 360. It's not that I think older games look bad, it's just that I see fewer and fewer redeeming qualities as the years go by. I see a lot of people talk about how they think the game looked gorgeous for its time, that the prince looks stunning and environmental artwork truly transports you to the Middle East. What a load of turd. And I know, beauty is subjective, so you can think what you want. It really doesn't bother me in the slightest. If you think the Sands of Time looks gorgeous, then I'm happy for you, guy, but I would be lying to myself if I said that this game was pretty. Everything is pointy or cubic, there isn't a beveled edge in sight, all the textures are flat. I mean, just look at these nipples. Do these look like the nipples of a champion to you? Obviously, this game never stood a chance. It was limited by hardware, just as most games that strive for a more realistic look are, and that's my point. How can you judge something that was practically forced to look the way that it does? It doesn't really seem fair, does it? I will say though, my stance is and will always be, as long as the game is fun or memorable in some way, then I couldn't care less what it looks like. It could look like Ryan Seacrest's withered and decrepit ballsack for all I care, and I expect many of you watching feel the same. Well, maybe not about the stroke, but at least the graphics thing. What I will criticize, however, is the way the game is presented. How does it make sure I know where I'm going? Will it show me the right way? Am I gonna need Google Maps up at some point? And for the most part, it's not so bad. There's obviously no problem with linear sections, it's always pretty easy to know where to go, but credit where credit is due, they're designed pretty well. The color schemes are not only pleasant to look at, but they guide your eye. They let you know where to go and where you might need to go next. It's just the more open sections that start to falter a bit. I never really got lost at any point during my 3 playthroughs, but I think that's mostly because I played so many games. You start to get the rhythm of these things after a while. You know that there has to be a way forward, so you think of the mechanics at your disposal and you figure it out. That's not to say that I think less experienced players would get stuck though. I guess what I'm trying to say is that in more open sections, the environmental design is pretty lazy. It seems like striving for realism meant that the color palette can sometimes stagnate. There are climbable ledges in this game that are almost the same color as the wall that they stick out from. That's just bad design. I'm not saying that everything needs to be like Uncharted, where every ledge needs to be the brightest color that you can find, but maybe twist the contrast dial up a bit. Let me know what I can and cannot interact with. Draw my eye towards the sexiest ledge in the room. Give those ledges the attention they deserve. I think one of the reasons that this tends to happen in the more open sections is because open sections are a bit harder to design. The more space there is, the more difficult it is to ensure that the player is on the right track. To expand, I'm going to need to talk about the visions. If you've never played the game before, I'll explain. In order to save the game, you need to step into these clusters of sand and light, and when you do so, the prince goes, "Oh, that's so Raven," and sees a glimpse of the future. Sometimes it's story related, but most of the time it's gameplay related. They show you how to approach any given challenge, which actually ends up taking away most of the challenge. What a shocker. Whilst these visions are a great way to spice up the obligatory save mechanic, the Prince of Persia team clearly leaned on them way too much. They practically show you what to do. Why put all that effort into designing the environment when we can just have the visions do it all for us? Now, just to be clear, I'm not talking about the art design. Aesthetically speaking, the art design is rather well thought out. The ways in which the room is decorated, the patterns that cover each wall, they're great. I completely admire the ability to convey a theme, so in that sense, mission accomplished. What I'm talking about is level design. Take this hallway that I showed you earlier. Notice how the ledges are significantly darker than the rest of the hallway. They create contrast whilst also fitting with the color palette. This is art design in harmony with level design. It looks good, whilst also drawing your eye and conveying a gameplay opportunity. Whereas in this room, mostly everything against the wall is a slightly different shade of white. This may sound incredibly petty, but when you're navigating this massive area, everything can start to blend together. Hopefully that helps to clear up my point. Art design is great. Level design is also great, but only in linear sections, as it falls flat in the open areas. We good? Fantastic! Now let's move on. Despite the shortcomings of the visual design of the environment, the combat is another story. It's simple, yet effective. Enemies are differentiated by colour, specifically red, blue, and grey. Red guys can be vaulted, blue guys need you to spike off the wall, and the grey guys... well, the grey guys are actually a bit inconsistent, but the red and the blue stuff is fan-dabby-dozy. Distinguishing enemy types by colour might sound like Baby's first combat system, but it works. Not only is it intuitive, but it also makes sense in the context of the story. Red guys belong to the Azad army, blue guys to King Shahriman, and the grey are just a bunch of randoms that were, I guess, hanging out inside the palace? Within the first encounter of each enemy type, I know just how to deal with them. I vault the red guys and I can kill them. I vault the blue guys and they're a little more feisty, so I need to figure out something else. It's a good way of encouraging immediate experimentation. That might be about all the experimentation that the combat allows for, but it's well designed nonetheless.
So, this is the thanks I get for saving your life.
You don't understand.
The audio is actually quite well done. Scratch that, the music and voice acting, good. Everything else sucks. The overall sound design is just weird at times. It seems like the whole thing was mixed so poorly. Some sound effects are ridiculously loud, the music is always loud, and the voices are always quiet. I tried turning both music and sound effects down to halfway so I could at least hear what the characters were saying whilst also hearing everything else, and it didn't do much. There's parts of the game where you really have to try to listen to what's being said because the audio is so overcrowded. To make matters worse, there's no subtitles either, and it's not like I'm going to be able to lip read these chain chomp wannabes now, is it? The sound effects seem to be the worst offenders. They're not all bad, but sometimes there's a sound of dripping water, but it sounds like it's right in your ear, or running water can sound robotic. It's weird, to say the least. There's also the issue of no sound effects at times, specifically with the spiky poles. They pop up out of the ground without making a beep, but you know there's supposed to be a sound effect there because you've heard it before. I'm not crazy, I swear. It's not until you're about 5 feet away from the sound starts to fade in. This would be fine if they were inherently quiet, but they're not. They're about as discreet as a shot in the next cubicle over. You know what else is loud? Teleportation. I know, right? Who knew? Every damn time a sand creature spawns or teleports closer, the idea of a dash of bleach in my orange juice just sounds oh so delicious. It's so obnoxiously loud, and this was after I turned the sound effects volume down to halfway. If I turn it down much more, I can't hear my sword noises. Of the many problems that I've mentioned with the audio design and the mixing of this game, none of them are quite as bad as the scarab beetles. That sound you're hearing right now, it isn't the mechanism of the Switch, it's the beetles. Let's talk more on the good noises now, shall we? The voices are pretty good. Yuri Lowenthal as the prince is great. He perfectly conveys just how arrogant the prince is at the beginning of the journey, and also how he slowly improves over time. Yuri also plays the Azard guard during the Palin's defense system puzzle. I'm annoyed, but also impressed, but also disgusted.
Now, pick up the other three!
Joanna Wasick? What's it gotta do with you? She's kind of hit or miss, says Farah. She's good in general conversation, and I don't know if her and Yuri were recording at the same time. I mean, I doubt it, but they certainly bounce off each other quite well. My main problem with her voice acting is in the heat of the moment kind of situation, specifically combat. She could be getting absolutely devastated by sand creatures, and all she can muster up is a
Help me!
Are you sure, Farah? Because I'm not sure you mean it. Why don't you give it another go? Really convince me.
Help me!
Now, you see, this is the problem with... Oh shit. I'm not gonna be too hard on Joanna though, she only has 2 acting credits. Like ever. According to her IMDb page, she never acted again after The Sands of Time. She's now an assistant attorney though, so she's doing pretty well for herself anyway. Maybe. I don't know. It's the internet. She might also be 68 years old. What do I know? I'm unemployed. Well done anyway, Joanna. I'm happy for you. Even though I've never met you. Just trying to be nice. One completely inconsequential gripe that I have with the voice acting of Farah and the Prince is that they both have English accents.
I'm sorry.
Why?
I know what it is to lose a father.
The Prince is Persian and Farah is Indian. It's like Ubisoft just said, as long as you don't sound American, we're all good to go. Did you think I would have noticed, Patrice? Finally, let's talk about the music, because this stuff is muy good. It's mostly safe for cinematics, combat encounters, and a few platforming sections here and there, but when it gets going, oh man, it gets me going. Each track immediately takes me to a different portion of the game. It's all so distinct, so memorable, even the little music bites to play when you drink water. Do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Tracks used for combat are especially great. They do such a good job of putting you in a fighting mood. Layering on a distortion in the background for a more rock feel, but also having a distinctly Middle Eastern flair about it. This is a soundtrack, ladies and gentlemen. This is how you do it. This is an art form, and not enough developers seem to care about it. The gameplay of The Sands of Time is both its defining characteristic and its biggest weakness. Being the first in a series that hopes to reinvent the wheel for the way that 3D platformers are played means that there's bound to be some slip-ups. The combat is probably the best example of this. At the time of release, the Prince had the most animations linked to a single character in all of video games, and it shows. The fluidity of animation in this game is incredible. Every action that Prince performs seems almost believable, despite being completely, even outrageously unrealistic. That's how good the animation is, and having animation this good makes gameplay that much better. It makes combat feel fun and responsive. You may only be pressing a couple of buttons, but the Prince has just leapt over the monster, slashed them over the head, and sucked the sand out of them. You feel agile, you feel powerful. But the feeling starts to fade. You get used to the moveset. You start to realize that so much effort has been put into the fluidity of movement that attention has been taken away from the complexity of mechanics. And because of this, combat becomes stale and repetitive, and it does so very quickly. The average completion time of my 3 playthroughs was around 5.5 hours. Despite the game's short length, it still somehow finds a way to become boring. There simply isn't enough to do during combat. There aren't enough new features or enemy types introduced throughout the game to spice up the gameplay. When fighting sand creatures, you've got a few options. You can smack the square button, but most of them block your attacks, so that goes out the window pretty quick. Your next best bet is to leap over your enemies to take them by surprise, and if that doesn't work, you just leap off the wall. And that's about it. There are some powers that you get, like the ability to stab enemies and freeze them in time. You can slow down time, and then there's this mega freeze attack. But none of them really do anything to make you feel like you're stringing a bunch of moves together. With the way that the Prince moves, I want to feel like an unstoppable, pretty precious ballerina, but the design of the combat means that I have to stop in order to win. To actually kill the sand creatures, you need to stab them with the dagger of time and collect their sand. Now, there's nothing wrong with this mechanic on its own, except when you couple this mechanic with the prince's ever so limited moveset. The combat can't help but feel stop and start-ish. It becomes routine. Vault, slash, stab, and repeat. The only variation to this routine is that you might have to spring off the wall instead. When I came to this conclusion, my first thought was, is that an accurate observation? Is the combat really that routine, or was I just doing the same thing over and over again? Am I the one that's to blame? And I couldn't answer that straight away, so I decided to play the game again. Really experiment, really try to utilize the whole moveset and see if I could have a little more fun with it. The first thing that I tried was dodging more. I thought maybe rolling around on the floor might make this a little bit more fun. Not only did I find that I was wrong, but the game is inadvertently designed to discourage you from doing so. Dodging and vaulting are the same button. If you try to vault the wrong enemy, you'll end up on your back. And because of the way that enemies can crowd you, you may end up accidentally vaulting an enemy that you can't actually vault. So it's only really safe to roll around vaultable enemies, but even when you do that, it's just quicker to finish them by vaulting. Notice how I say quicker and not easier. It is simply more efficient to just vault the enemies. Okay, so the roly-polies aren't great. What about the countering? That's something I didn't do very much of, so let's try that. I found that countering is especially good for birds. Before I would block and then attack, but countering means that I'm finishing the birds off in one fluid motion. However, many of the times that you'll encounter birds will be whilst you're on balance beams, so the option to block or counter is somewhat redundant. On the whole, birds and bats, those pesky bats, are just annoying. They're never really thrown in with the main enemy type, so you never need to learn how to manage them, how to juggle everything all at once. Instead, it's just wait, attack, it's just another routine. I did try countering with the main enemy types and I found some satisfaction there. Slashing an enemy and then counter-stabbing another made me moist 9 times out of 10, and I would most definitely recommend it to a friend. But since the prince is so agile and mobile, and you often need to resort to vaulting and jumping off walls, you're too busy bouncing around all over the place like a frog on LSD to actually be within range of an attack. The last thing to consider is time powers, and they're not that great either. The free stab is pretty good. It's balanced well, considering every time that you use it, it means that you can't collect the sand from their enemy, but it doesn't add to the variety that I'm looking for. Also, there were plenty of times in each playthrough where I ended up free stabbing when I just wanted to collect some sand. This might sound like a minor grievance, but I don't like accidentally stabbing people, friend or foe. I much prefer to intentionally stab. It also often meant that I was now further away from being able to use the Mega Freeze Time ability, which, by the way, is a cheap, broken, and overemphasized mechanic. Wow, man, don't you think that's a little harsh? Shut up! Shut up, you limp penis. It's lazy. The move itself is fun. It's even fun to use at times, but its implementation is sloppy at best. The move even influences the design of combat encounters. There are times where there's just wave after wave after wave of enemy being thrown at you. It's not difficult, it's just boring, so you end up being forced to use the Mega Freeze attack just to finish the fight. But sometimes you can't even do that. The spawning of enemies can be so delayed at times that when you activate the ability, you kill the bad guys that are already in the room, no problem, but then you have to wait for the next batch of enemies to spawn, in slow motion, all whilst the timer is running down. You mean to tell me that this ability that you are practically forcing me to use, that took so long to become available to use, you even made me create a new power tank once I got a new sand tank just to use it. You're telling me that I do all of that and you don't even have the decency to spawn in at a consistent rate? You inconsiderate fanny. Do you see what I mean? Have I made my point? The Mega Freeze ability is a fine concept. It's just that many combat encounters are practically designed around the use of the move. It's just sloppily implemented. I want to have options when I fight. Do you get what I'm putting down? On a lighter note, one mechanic that I ended up having quite a bit of fun with during combat was the rewind mechanic, which is strange considering it's obviously designed primarily to be used for platforming. But if you use it as a way to instantly get revenge on an enemy rather than just using it at the last possible moment to prevent death, you can actually end up having a good bit of fun with it. I found that when an enemy managed to hit me, instead of just recovering and moving on, I would rewind time and eviscerate him. It gives me this instant sense of satisfaction by learning from my mistakes. Although it is worth mentioning that the only reason I had fun with this is because I was getting hit a lot more, and the only reason I was getting hit a lot more was because I was experimenting. And I also suck. So this might not be something that everyone has fun with, but I encourage you to try it anyway. You know, the next time you decide to play this 15-year-old game. One strange thing about the rewind mechanic though, is that whenever an enemy is killed, the little timer that indicates how far you can rewind restarts. I don't know why this is a thing or what sort of balance it provides, but fine. I know it exists, so I can manage it. One little caveat to this though, is that the timer also restarts when Farah kills an enemy. Luckily, I didn't get screwed over by this at any point in my playthroughs, but it doesn't mean that Farah can't unintentionally screw you over by killing an enemy, you get hit with low health, can't rewind, and then you die. Forever. This is really unlikely though, since Farah can only really kill birds, since other enemies need to be stabbed by the dagger. So it's nothing worth crying about, but this is my party, and I will cry whenever I damn well please. What does make me cry though is that Farah can shoot you with arrows, and they hurt quite a bit. What's worse is that she shows no remorse.
Sorry!
You keep on like that and I'll give you something to be sorry about, you little c***. Something else that breaks my heart is the sense of progression in this game. It is practically non-existent, and when it does exist, it's incredibly lackluster or even breaks the game. Unless of course we're talking about the slow removal of the prince's clothes throughout. Does anybody else get a little bit excited when he finally takes his top off? Am I gay? Besides the clothes thing though, the main progression is handled through visions or new swords, and the visions, well, they suck, because you see a new move in a cutscene and you're like, guess I can do that now. Thanks for the update, bucko. Finding new swords is actually really fun right until the very last one. Getting a new sword usually means that you do a little more damage, or that you can also knock down weak walls to reveal some hidden areas, which is pretty cool. New abilities are always fun, but the last sword practically breaks the combat. Since Farah steals your sword and dagger, the game decides you need something to fight with, so they give you a new sword, but they can't give you a new dagger of time. There's only one of those after all. How do you fix that? I know! Let's just make it so everyone dies in one hit. Screw everything that you've been doing for the last 4 hours. Turns out you could have just beaten them all to death the whole time. You know what's truly sad though? By this point, I'm so tired of the combat that breaking it is actually as refreshing as my orange juice. Just like the boss fights in this game. God, it's so good to see boss fights handled with such grace, such dignity. I'm just kidding, they suck. The boss fight with King Shahriman is abysmal. You are essentially just taking out the pawns before you can actually attack the big bad. And when you get to attack the big bad, you just counter him and then smack him until the noises stop. But at least the fight with Dad is over pretty swiftly. The fight with the shifty beard man lasts forever. I shaved my balls before the fight, and by the end, I was sprouting. It's so boring. I counter, you counter. I counter, you counter. Oh wait, I'll counter, you're gonna counter too. Oh my god, just kill me. Then it looks like there might be a phase 2. Okay, here we go. Now it's on. Let's go. Are you joking? Was that it? You might as well have just jumped off the balcony and saved me the effort, you dunce. Let's talk about the platforming now, shall we? Because it's pretty damn groovy. Not to mention that the animation is so damn good, so anytime you do anything, you feel awesome. It's amazing that in one moment the prince can seem as light as a feather, but in another, he's like a sack of bricks. The sense of weight that the animation allows for makes all of platforming immensely satisfying. I just wish there was more challenge baked into it. I say baked because platforming can be challenging in different ways. The first is what the Sands of Time suffers from: inaccuracy. Whether it's thinking you've jumped in the right direction but you completely missed the mark, or maybe you rewind back just before you made that fatal mistake but you rewind in the middle of a jumping animation, even though it looked like you were home safe. Granted, sometimes it's my own fault for being impatient, but other times you're just unlucky. These are some of the main reasons that platforming is challenging. Not because the game requires you to string a bunch of successful actions together, but because you have to fight with the game. This doesn't mean that platforming is bad. I think it's by far the best aspect of the gameplay for me, and I really think that it's a lot of fun. But having to wrestle with the controls every now and then is not. I had situations where it seems like the camera angle was forcing me to walk instead of run, so I'd fail at a timed challenge. There's other times that I'm moving on a ledge and then the camera angle changes, so I have to wiggle the left stick until I find the right direction to make him start moving again. I know that sounds incredibly minor and even petty, but I don't ever want to have to wrestle with the game. Much less do I want to do it regularly. The second challenge is in the complexity of mechanics and level design. Once the main mechanics of platforming have been established, they never really become anything more. I'm not talking about introducing more mechanics, I'm talking about demanding more of me. I want you to punish me, make me feel something. The only real time in the game when I need to be successfully chaining moves together is in the prison area. But even then it's just about keeping the pace, there's no real threat. Whilst it might be great symbolism when the prince strips himself of everything that once made him the arrogant prince, ripping off his shirt isn't just an edgy act of objectification. Which, by the way, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with. There is nothing wrong with having a sexy character. But back to my point, it demonstrates his transformation from an arrogant boy to a courageous man. so now he needs to be tested like a man. While the prison is my favorite bit of platforming in the game, it's still not very challenging. It's great at creating a sense of momentum, a sense of real pace, but I'm not really doing anything more complicated than I've already done before. The same can be said for the final stretch of the game. While I won't dare say that climbing the final tower without the ability to rewind time isn't tense, because it most certainly made my gooch sweat, but it's tense for the wrong reasons. At least it partly is. For those of you that are probably thinking, who cares why it's tense? All that matters is that it is tense. And you know what? You're right, it really doesn't matter. In that moment, the developers wanted me to feel like the stakes had been raised. I'm outside climbing this massive structure, I can't rewind time, I've lost my shirt and now my nipples are bleeding. I completely agree. Mission has most definitely been accomplished. All I'm saying is that it achieves this tension in part due to inaccuracy. The camera angles in this section of the game can be especially crazy at times, so it's even more likely that you're going to be screwed over, because you can't tell which way to point the stick. If you're going to jump upwards or outwards, I know this because I experienced it many times in multiple playthroughs. In short, tension should be achieved through an increase in complexity of level design, rather than the imminent feeling of being screwed over. Again, I like this section, I think it is fun. That doesn't mean it should not be criticized. So, I'm going on about how I think the platforming should have been more complex. It's too easy, I wanted more of a challenge, I wanted it to choke me, but I didn't want to pass out. But how could the game actually achieve that? For starters, incorporate more traps with platforming opportunities. Life's not all about spinning wall blades of death, you know, how about some swinging wall blades of death in between pole swings? How's about treating the rewind mechanic as more than just a glorified checkpoint system? There, I said it, and I don't care who knows. The rewind mechanic is just a fancy checkpoint system. You could have had it so that after the sands were released, maybe you find out there are areas that are impervious to the sands' effects. Maybe they are time constants. You could have the prince complete a quick chain of platforming challenges, but at the end of it, in order to push a switch, he has to die. So you push the switch, die, rewind time, but now the door is open, because the switch is a time constant. Just an idea there for you. Something else that was so ridiculously underutilized was the slow down time mechanic. It's almost completely unnecessary. I only needed to use it once across multiple playthroughs. And I think the reason that I needed to use it is actually pretty rare. Just before this puzzle, there's a fight, and during this fight I was experimenting and taking a few hits, you know, just being terrible at the game. And at one point, I had just killed a sand creature and then Farah shot me.
Sorry!
What did I say? And because I just killed the sand creature, I couldn't rewind time, so I just had to deal with my now incredibly low health. It's also worth mentioning that this area has no fountain and no way back to one. So I get to the puzzle, and there's a portion of it where you have to take full damage. It is unavoidable. My health was so low that this tiny bit of full damage would kill me. Now I'm trapped in this room. Even when you die, it spawns you with the health that you had after the fight. What fantastic design! Luckily, I figured out that slowing down time can actually prevent full damage from lower heights, so it did save me from having to restart the game due to this incredibly rare circumstance. Other than that though, it should have been aborted. Why not throw in some stuff that spins really fast so we need to use slow-mo to get past it? I have to imagine that they had stuff like that planned, but just didn't have enough time to implement it. Otherwise, why even include the slow-mo feature if it's never necessary? I just would have liked to have seen more of an effort into making platforming a kind of frenetic puzzle. Speaking of puzzles, I am a master of transitions. Let's talk about those for a minute. None of them are challenging, which is perfectly fine. They're clearly designed to be a nice change of pace. Even the ones that have you wait around for Farah to squeeze through a crack and pull a switch aren't so bad. At least there's some light banter to help to develop the characters. However, they could have all been at least a little more challenging if they weren't all shown in the visions. The one puzzle that could have actually been a little bit of a challenge is bloody narrated. The palace defense system puzzle is kind of a pointless puzzle anyway, since all it does is make life way harder for the prince. You think some spiky poles are going to stop the sand creatures? They can teleport, you dense penis! But it still could have been fun to figure out on your own. It's a simple puzzle of matching symbols and pathfinding. Instead, you've got Yuri Lowenthal pretending to be the only English commoner in all of the Middle East. Why not just show some establishing shots so you know that you have to match the symbols and let the player figure out the rest for themselves? There's even a map of it on the damn wall. If the players get really stuck, you could just have the prince talk to himself and explain what to do. It's not like he doesn't talk to himself anyway. Also, this puzzle presents a plot hole. How is the Azad guard still alive? The only reason that Farah, the prince, and the local dealer are still alive is because each of them possesses an artifact of time. Farah has her medallion, the prince has the dagger of time, and the vizier has his staff. This guy's got nothing. Let's not forget that we just leave the door open when we get there. You can even see the sand floating in the entryway. I know this shouldn't be that big of a deal, but it really aggresses my colon. Because you know that when they were designing this puzzle, they knew it wouldn't make any sense for this guy to still be alive. But they did it anyway. The audacity. I bet by this point some of you might be wondering if I even like this game, considering how many times I've popped a squad on it, and I do, I really do. I think The Sands of Time is a great game. I mean, it must be if I can play it 3 times in a row without positively leaping into a noose. The game is good, alright, but to ignore all of its faults would be completely ridiculous. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned how I thought that The Sands of Time was way worse than I remembered it being, but it's also way better than I gave it credit for. I think so far I've done a rather good job of explaining why it's worse than I remember it being. And whilst I've praised it here and there, the main reason for my saying it's better than I ever gave it credit for is the story. The story is pretty plot-light, and of what there is pretty simplistic, but it's the characters that make this game stand out. I fully believe that you could have the most boring, most mundane, by-the-numbers plot that the world has ever known, but if you've got good characters, you can still make a masterpiece. Whilst The Sands of Time's plot is hardly boring or mundane, it involves time travel and saving the world for God's sake, but its plot isn't exactly groundbreaking. The protagonist messes up and by the end he fixes his mistake. That's obviously an immense oversimplification, but there was never really any doubt that we wouldn't succeed. Keep in mind, I am not knocking the game for this. It's simply an observation. So if the game is so predictable, why is it still so enjoyable? Well, boys and girls, it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. You know what the destination of life is? Death. How dull. Inviting but dull. Living is the interesting part. We see our characters grow and develop, as does their relationship with one another. That's the good stuff. That's what keeps us invested. You think I watched 8 seasons of The Walking Dead for the plot? I laugh at you. It's the characters that keep me going. I want to see more of that Rick Grimes sweat. At the start, the prince is so incredibly one-note. He's arrogant and even pompous at times. He's so desperate to impress his father that he doesn't care what he has to do to achieve it. He murders the innocents of the Maharaja's kingdom just so his father has a gift for the Sultan of Azad. His arrogance is what unleashes the sands. If he had stopped to listen to the princess of the kingdom that was sworn to guard the hourglass, things would have been very different. And the way he talks about Farah, or even women in general, further shows how immature and childish he is. His personality reeks of a boy desperate to be a man. He acts how he imagines men to act. He thinks the victors reserve the right to assume and talk down to, when in fact the true victors have no need, because they have respect. Something that the prince must earn throughout the game, from both us, the player, and Farah. At the start, their relationship is understandably complicated. He's just ransacked her entire kingdom, she's probably about to be sold into slavery, and to top it all off, he's just brought about the end of the world. What a charming young man. Not to mention the fact that the prince is hardly pleasant to be around. He feels no sense of accountability for his actions. It really is like talking to a child.
I saw my father turn to sand.
And Farah just lost everything, literally everything, because you stole it from her. However, as the game progresses, we see them start to become playful, even dare I say it, banterous. And of course, a romance starts to blossom, which is incredibly cliche, but there are wrenches consistently being thrown into the works to test the two of them. The prince sees visions of Farah stealing the dagger, and when he awakens he becomes defensive and standoffish. Farah doesn't know about the visions, so it seems like the prince continues to regress for no reason at all. There is constant, justifiable conflict on both sides, rather than one character flip-flopping to create the illusion of conflict. That, folks, is good writing. We see the prince hit peak paranoia when he hesitates stabbing the hourglass. This is the prince's lowest point. Even though his visions give him just cause for caution, he still knows that he's messed up again. Farah then takes it upon herself to do what it seems the prince can't. She uses their developing romance as a pawn, whilst also satisfying some of her desires. The two presumably sleep together, but when the prince wakes up, she's gone, and would you believe it, she's taken the dagger, the cheeky little mare. This scene isn't only good because it shows Farah isn't quite as fragile as she lets on, but because it's also a great piece of juxtaposition, and is even a good metaphor. Farah goes from cradling him to leaving him to fend for himself. It also shows that he needs to mature, and he needs to do it fast. Previously, he had thought he had become a man after the prison, but his hesitation proved that there was still work to be done. Now the prince must swallow his pride and save the day. Stealing the dagger of time to save the world on your own after consistently saying, "I can't do the things that you can," seems incredibly short-sighted and stupid, because it is. But the prince hasn't really left her much of a choice. She thinks he's lost, so she sets out to do the job herself. When Farah dies, the prince realizes the true error of his ways. This is all his fault. It's a stark contrast to the conversation in the beginning of the game. Now he holds himself accountable, he even ignores the Vizier's promise of eternal glory. Something that he was completely enamored with at the beginning of the game. He then does a bunch of crazy cutscene acrobatics that could never have been pulled off in the actual game, and then he rewinds time, all the way to the beginning of the story. This time, with the dagger. Instead of using the dagger and his newfound knowledge of the sands of time to sack the Maharaja's kingdom once again, but this time with far less apocalypse, he finds Farah and tells her everything. Turns out the narration we've been hearing this whole time was the prince telling Farah the story, which is pretty neat. I do enjoy a good twist. He then kills the Vizier when he comes a-knocking in probably what is one of the worst boss fights I've ever seen in my entire life, and then goes for a shot in the dark to see if there's any way of rekindling the romance they once had, as if their love would transcend through time. He finds that it can't be done and leaves Farah and her kingdom in peace. The prince leaves with nothing. He simply goes back to his kingdom, but this time as a man. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a character arc. It's not a particularly inspired one, but it's a damn good one. There is a clear change in the prince at the start of the game to the prince at the end of the game. It's satisfying and also justifiable. That is why I like the story so much. Hell, that's why I like the game so much, because of the characters. Of course, the story isn't perfect. There's some holes here and there, and there's some stuff that's never really explained all that well. Like, why does the Vizier actually want the Sands of Time? He says it will make him immortal, but how? Does simply possessing it make you immortal? Can you drink it? Also, King Shahraman is exceptionally mentally deficient. Isn't it King 101 to not trust the traitor of a rival kingdom? The Vizier even looks crafty. I would have given him a quick shank in the throat and moved right on. What are those water rooms? Why doesn't the prince turn into a sand creature whilst he's sleeping in the mystery area? The door is wide open and he's not carrying the dagger or wearing the amulet. Why don't those sand creatures follow the prince out into the puzzle area? How is the Azad guard still alive without possessing an artifact of time? Why was it so easy for the prince to get inside the Maharaja's treasure vault? Why did the Maharaja even keep the sands of time? If they're really that dangerous, why not just drop them into the deepest parts of the ocean where no one could find them? Like I said, it's not perfect, but it's good enough to be great. If that makes any sense whatsoever. So at the end of it all, I stand by what I said. The Sands of Time is worse than I remembered it, but way better than I ever gave it credit for. The combat that I once loved is now repetitive and time-consuming, with little room for expansion or experimentation, but the stellar animations keep me from reaching for the pills. The platforming is excellent, and the rewind mechanic makes for some good trial and error experiences that aren't nearly as aggravating as other platformers of not only its time, but also the current day. I just wish it would have left a few scars. Is that too much to ask for? The same could be said for the puzzles. The downtime makes for a great change of pace and presents a good opportunity for the Prince and Farah to engage in some quality bants. A chance to develop their relationship, but that doesn't mean that it gets a pass for showing me exactly how to complete each challenge. Maybe just let me struggle at least a little bit. And the story, as simplistic as it is great. The prince is so well defined at both the beginning and the end of the adventure that a clear and satisfying arc is achieved. Yuri Lowenthal was fantastic. Without the incredibly stellar facial animations of the present day, he still managed to present and develop a character with just his voice. Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time is a damn good game. It's not a masterpiece by any means, but it doesn't have to be. If somehow you haven't played this game, I would heavily encourage you to do so. Some say it's the best Prince of Persia game that there is. I don't know about that, I'd need to play the rest of them to decide. It's been a really long time since I played the other games, so I guess I'll just have to play the rest and get back to you. So, stay tuned for that, and I'll see you in the next one.